When I was young, I never really quite got round to liking school. I still remember what every morning felt like. My mother sat all five of us siblings down on a bench and used to get us ready for school. School itself felt like it really dragged on. And as my siblings got distinctions and plaudits all around the country, I continued to struggle. It was during one of those days that I found out that I'd gotten a B minus on a history test. When I came back home, I was beaten up by the first time by my father. I was forced to sleep on the floor as a punishment. The next morning, as my mother buttoned up my collar in absolute silence, I managed to croak out the question that I'd held in for so long. Kyun padhu main? Why study? And my mother paused for a while and then told me that I needed to study so that I could be a successful man one day. And I thought about that. I went back to school that day and began trying in earnest to stay out of any kind of trouble whatsoever. I also began to withdraw away from my family, choosing instead to satisfy my curiosity in my own surroundings. There was a particular wooded area in the back of my house that always fascinated me. It was here that I started to make a lot of new friends, many of them much older than me. It was also here that I started to go through child abuse for the first time in my life. Now, when something of that sort happens to you at that kind of age, you tend to ignore it, but the signs manifest themselves. My grades began to drop, and I lost any remaining interest in school whatsoever. One of my teachers, she noticed the signs and stopped me after school one day and asked me what was up, and I asked her the same question that I'd asked my mother all those years ago. I asked her, "Kyun padhu main? Why study?" And she didn't think for a moment, and then she told me I needed to be educated so I could be born human. And I thought to myself that day, if I was inhuman right now, what was it that I was facing in the woods behind our house? My struggle with this question continued, and it reached a pinnacle by the time I got to college. Now, I don't come from a particularly well-endowed family, so when the time came for me to go to college, my father sold off a lot of his assets just to help me go to college. And I woke up one day in the middle of our winter break, alone in my dorm room, and thought to myself, I didn't want to wake up with this feeling for the rest of my life. I looked at myself in the mirror that day and asked myself, why study? That day, I wrote a post-it note for my roommate, went to the university registrar's office, and dropped out of college. When I came back home to Pakistan, there was silence for months, and it gave me all the time I needed to reflect on the decision that I'd made. It was also during this time that I happened to go to a slum village near my house, where I met a couple of children, and my short conversation with them revealed the extent of abuse that they were going through. And this led to an intense reckoning with my own past, and I became consumed with the desire to do something for them, so I just rented out a 2-room building and opened a daycare center for them, hoping to keep them off the streets and safe inside the daycare center. But of course, daycare centers don't function that way. And on days that I couldn't show up, the children would be back on the streets, exposed to the same dangers that they were before. And so, even though I'd hated every single moment of it, in order to pursue some kind of long-term empowerment, the daycare center eventually blossomed into a school. And even though I'd never wanted it, I ended up becoming a teacher. And it was during my first week as a teacher that what I dreaded the most happened. One of my students, about 5 years old, who was making the decision about whether he should go on the streets and work for his family or come to school, he came up to me and tugged me on the sleeve. And I looked down and he asked me, "Kyun padhu main? Why study?" And for the very first time in my life, somebody else had asked me that question. For the very first time in my life, for one of my very first students, I didn't have an answer. That was about 7 years ago. Since then, I've dedicated my life trying to find the answer to the question of why study. It has taken me to small towns and villages all across Pakistan, where the majority of our population resides. I chose to start my work in villages because the answer to why study is simpler in cities, where life follows a very neat trajectory. But it's much more complicated in villages. At one point, I'd become so obsessed with trying to find the answer to this question that I had perfected my farming skills in the middle of the searing heat of southern Punjab, gone on a wheat harvest along with my team. And in the middle of the harvest, when we were taking a break, I paused a farmer, I stopped him, and I asked him why he didn't send his 2 boys to school. And he looked at me with a heartbroken face, and he told me the story of his 2 boys. When the time came for his boys to go to school, he could only afford to send one of them because he didn't have the money. One of his boys went to the school while the other one remained in the fields, and the boy that went to the school grew frail and thin because he had to stay indoors and study all day. Eventually, he was diagnosed with weak eyesight as well. And by the time he graduated, one way or another, he went to all major cities of Pakistan but couldn't find a job. And eventually, he had to come back to the fields. But when he came back to the fields, he didn't have the strength to lift. He couldn't know how to operate the machinery. He was either educated or uneducated, but stuck in some kind of space in the middle. The boy stood right next to his father when I asked him this question, and he asked me, why study? Kyun padhun main? But while this is also happening in Pakistan, while Pakistan has its own share of educational problems, there is also something very interesting happening. In a country where almost half of the children are chronically malnourished and stunted, almost half of the population is expected to own smartphones by the year 2020. And because there are so many telecommunication companies around, the cost of owning a smartphone and using the internet is among the cheapest anywhere else on this planet. Technology, particularly the internet, gives us a unique opportunity to let children answer the question of why study. Following rigid curriculums was a need of the hour 50 years ago, when there was a vast array of knowledge, and it had to be segmented in order to be made accessible for children. But with the advent of the internet and of search services like Google, knowledge rests on our fingertips. And all across the country, in developing countries like Pakistan and many other countries, there is a substantial number of children who are enrolled in school right now, who might not necessarily get to go to university like all of us did, even though they should, which makes it even more imperative for us to not chain and cage them inside rigid curriculums, to teach them something for 10 or more years without giving them a reason, and at the end of it, telling them something along the lines of they don't know enough to become a productive member of society. It simply cripples their faith in the learning process, just like it crippled the faith of the farmer's son. I have traveled all across Pakistan, and I've seen firsthand what happens when children are given access to technology. We were in a couple of villages recently where we had to teach children the concept of circuits in 6th grade science. Now, we did that, but we did that with a twist. We gave them access to the internet when we taught them how to use search services like Google and Yahoo and others. And they not only studied circuits after we came back into their room 2 hours later, they'd gone much more above and beyond that. We were in a village where there had been a lot of cases of abuse and abductions, and the girls in that village had studied the topic of circuits, and then they'd learned how to make a simple door alarm using clothesline and hair clips. Boys in a neighboring village which didn't have any electricity had studied the concept of circuits and then gone ahead and seen how they could repair old batteries so that they could have light inside their homes. All of them did this immediately and voluntarily. These are 6th graders. There are more and more examples that I have of the magic of contextual learning. We were in a village in Rajanpur in southern Punjab. We were expected to teach young girls the concept of an area of a border. Now, if you know this, it's a relatively simple mathematical concept. There's a rectangle within a rectangle, and you have to find out the area of a border. Except the girls had such weak foundations in arithmetic that no matter what we did, they couldn't grasp the topic. We tried for days, but to no avail. Until we started to notice that the fields in which the girls worked in all had trees planted on their edges. These trees acted as windbreaks. So when the winds came, the trees would prevent the soil from being eroded away. Every year before the girls went out for their harvest, they sat down with their families and they calculated the area that they could farm on. When we framed the mathematical problem, area of a border, in this context, it immediately clicked. They were able to make sense of it, they were able to solve all the problems, and they were able to move ahead. The answer then to why study is different for every child. And it's different according to what the children felt a pressing need to learn on any given day. On any given day, the girls in the unsafe village wanted to be educated so that they could be safe. The boys in the power-starved village wanted to be educated so that they could have light inside their homes. The girls in the fields, they just wanted better yields. But despite all these signs that every single child is different and unique, we seem to be hell-bent on making them learn for exactly the same reasons. In my country, millions of children are now dropping out of school every single year because mass education simply doesn't make sense anymore. Children can't be expected to go to school for 10 plus years and then be told that they don't know enough. Instead, what we need to create is a much more unhinged form of learning in which children have the freedom to explore what they need to learn and apply it to their own daily lives. Now, my entire life, I've been an advocate of this, an advocate of unhinged learning. But regardless of where I go, teachers seem to be too skeptical of this fact. It seems messy and chaotic. Educators don't want to adapt to it. All around, there is a belief that it is the most unconstructive form of learning. But for kids, like I talked about, the ones we did the experiment with, it makes absolute sense. And so I've always been on this journey where I'm trying to prove to teachers that this does indeed work. And so I already told you about the experiment that we did in which we gave access to internet to the children and asked them to teach themselves. What we also did was, with their consent, we downloaded all of their search histories and mapped them onto an official curriculum, the curriculum that is used by Pakistan, by the state government. And so what we did was, if the child had learned something relatively easy, let's say in the 6th grade, let's say they learned about the definition of circuits, we would plot it right here in the bottom. But let's say they learned something really difficult, like a potential application of circuits to build batteries, which doesn't come until 10th grade in Pakistan. We plotted it over here. In the end, we joined all of these plots together to show teachers that children were indeed following the curriculum, not just in the order that they thought it to be. And this is how the curriculum graph always looks like when children are going to a regular school. The difficulty increases along with the grade level, and eventually by the time you reach 10th grade, you've come to a lot of difficult topics. But this is what our graph looked like, an absolute mess. But in reality, it made absolute sense. It had helped children answer the question of why study, because they'd seen the real-life applications of all of these topics in their lives, in their communities, and to their own problems. Now, we couldn't go back to the school with this. It would make no sense at all. And so we had our head in our hands until we ran into a group of musicians. And that really changed the way we thought. And I talk about music because there's certainly something about art. We always have a soft spot for it. When a musician plays a different chord, or when an artist uses a new brush stroke, we don't chide them for it. We appreciate them for it. But when a child exhibits a different learning pattern, we scold them, we beat them down. We force them to fall into line. And that's where all of the problem lies. And so we called this group of musicians, and we asked them, could you help us assign music to the learning patterns of children? So let's say if the children had learned something relatively simple in 6th grade, let's go back to circuits. Let's say if they'd learned the concept of circuits and then seen a diagram for circuits, a relatively smaller jump, it played a chord like this. There we go. That's a chord. And if they made a big jump, let's say by studying the circuits and their definition, and then they learned how to make a battery, which was a giant jump, it played a long, drawn-out chord like this. In the end, we asked all of the musicians to put their chords together. And I think I'm going to leave you with that. What we call the symphonies of learning. What you're about to hear in a moment is a soundtrack of learning for an underserved classroom somewhere in the heart of Pakistan. In it, you will be able to see the excitement, anxiety, struggle, and depression of children as they try to answer the question of why study. If nothing, it will convince you that learning is always a beautiful process. Now, this is not a regular symphony by any means, but we'll show you that more and more of learning and its control needs to be handed over to the students. so that they can build the kind of learning that they deem relevant for themselves. And they can live in an era and learn skills which help them solve real problems in their life, not 20 years or 25 years after they started their education, but on the day they learned something. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you with the Symphonies of Learning.